Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy Giving Tuesday. Happy Just Tuesday if you are somebody not working in the nonprofit world. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mandy Sally. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation and the host of our monthly Censorship Series program. So today I'm really excited to get into our conversation because I think it's very on brand for the time of season we are currently in. I'm going to be talking with Gabby and Sean about how to avoid censorship at your holiday gathering. And we're going to get into a little bit of what are some of the dangers of self-censorship, all that good stuff. We're hoping that this conversation will be helpful to many of you who might be, breaking bread with some relatives or friends who don't always see eye to eye on things this holiday season. So that is the topic of our discussion today. I'm going to introduce Gabby and Sean in just a second. But before we get into it, I did mention that it is Giving Tuesday. So, folks, we here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, we are a nonprofit, and we host these virtual programs totally for free with ASL interpretation, and we would love your support. So, if you learned something from one of our conversations or you appreciate the work we're doing, we would really appreciate a donation today, particularly since it is Giving Tuesday. And you can head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate to contribute to our work, or any nonprofit of your choosing. Braver Angels and Fire, also nonprofits. And I know everybody's development team is working extra hard today. So if you've got it in your heart to throw our orgs a few bucks, we would very much appreciate it. Okay. Spiel over. Let me introduce my fabulous, wonderful guests today. First up, we have Sean Stevens. Sean is the Chief Research Advisor at FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, if you don't know. Frequent guests here on the Censorship Series. For almost 2 decades, Sean's research has focused on understanding how moral convictions produce motivated reasoning within the political domain, how this motivated reasoning can distort research in the social sciences, and how motivated reasoning can lead to political intolerance and create obstacles to political compromise. So thanks so much for being here, Sean. And joining Sean, we have Gabriella Kearns. Gabby is the Director of Communications and Marketing at Braver Angels. And before joining Braver Angels, she was an assistant producer at NBC News and worked as a political organizer in her home state of Michigan. So thanks so much for being here as well, Gabby. Couldn't think of 2 people more appropriate to have with me today to talk about this conversation. So first off, Sean, I'd love to start with you, touching on your research and your expertise. I'm wondering if you could tell us how you define self-censorship.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast here. Our definition of self-censorship at FIRE is grounded in spiral of silence theory, which comes from Elizabeth Noel Newman in the 1970s. She was someone who was a young child in Nazi Germany. So this developed through her experience with that and seeing how people were basically how opinions that may have been held by the majority fell into silence because of other social pressures, conditions that were present. So our definition of self-censorship, we actually present a very clear definition to the students in our survey. I'll just read it, and we try to make it very clear that we don't mean like you're trying to be polite. We really mean that you fear some kind of negative consequence for saying what you think. So we define it for students as refraining from sharing certain views because you fear social, professional, or violent consequences, whether in person or remotely, and whether the consequences come from state or non-state actors. We give some examples of each of these. So social consequences are exclusion from social events. Professional would be losing a job or an opportunity at a promotion. I left out legal, sorry. Prosecution or fine for something you said. And then violent is like assault or something worse, like we've seen fairly recently. That's our definition of it. So we try to make it very clear that it's not about being polite. Like there are situations where people will, not say things because it's like maybe just not the right time to say it, and you don't want to ruin the environment. And I'm sure we're on the border of some of that in what we might talk about today. The only other thing I'll emphasize on the construct is it's to an extent it's a disposition, right? Some people are going to be very willing to share their views regardless of the setting. And in spiral of silence theory, these individuals are called kind of the true believers. They don't really care about the consequences. They'll say whatever. The other end of the spectrum is there are people who are really shy, who really never want to really engage publicly with that many people or in public. And then the rest of us fall probably somewhere in between there on the spectrum. This can be influenced by situational pressures, et cetera, but I'll emphasize that people do kind of have a set point that they move around at.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And Gabby, I'd love to hear from you as well. Any thoughts on what self-censorship means to you, or how you're talking about this at Braver Angels as well?
Yeah. I think Sean's definition is probably more technical. It's probably more accurate than mine might be. But I was thinking, actually, hearing him speak was really helpful to me because Braver Angels, the first principle of the Braver Angels way is speaking freely, fully, and without fear. Now, the asterisk there is that Braver Angels is an organization where the whole purpose is that we're speaking with people we disagree with. So I think Sean makes a really good point that. And there are people we know in our lives that feel very, at ease sharing their opinion wherever, whenever. So maybe the asterisk there is when appropriate. So in Braver Angels, since we, are here to foster dialogue with people we disagree with, that core principle of speaking freely, fully, without fear is really important to us in our organization. But I'm sure there's a time and a place for that as well.
Yeah, and I will mention the Braver Angels events are. Everybody sort of follows the rules, right? That's the whole idea is, and unfortunately, at most of our holiday gatherings and most probably spaces we're going to be talking to others in, those rules are maybe not quite so present, right? And so you get some fiery reactions. But my next question is about the harms of self-censorship, right? I mean, I think I can assume that everybody here today is not a fan of self-censorship or censorship in general. It's a pretty safe assumption on my part. But I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more specifically about what some of the harms of self-censoring or the experience of censorship from family or peers are. And Gabby, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah. So I'll say one thing, in Braver Angels, I've heard people say, which I totally get, but we're not necessarily conversational absolutists. We're not like, you must have a political conversation, you must engage no matter what. That's not necessarily our starting point. I've heard people say internally, a no political conversation can be better than a really bad one. So there's that. But I will say, I've also heard from people who feel like, well, if I can't share what I really believe, then these people won't know me. And I think that is especially painful in situations where it's like with a parent or a child or a spouse, where the expectation is that that person knows you maybe better than anyone in this world. So I think that's a lot to sacrifice in a relationship. I think some people might say, well, it's a shame that we're at a time where our politics are so bound up in our identities, but that's the water we're swimming in. That's where we're at. So for a lot of people, that's really important to them. I'll say for myself, kind of the inverse of that, like the opposite of what it looks like to self-censor, those relationships in my life where I know I can share an opinion where maybe it's an opinion I believe 20%. It's something I'm just starting to get my arms around. I'm just starting to understand or figure out what I actually believe about something. Those relationships where I can start to share that and really have an honest conversation. I mean, I just wouldn't trade that for the world. So I actually think we're sacrificing a lot when we're not able to really share what we believe.
I very much agree. Sean, I'd love to hear from you on this question as well, or about some of the harms or dangers of self-censorship.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gabby hit a lot of things. The key one, I mean, from a psychological background, is if you don't really feel like you could be yourself, or you feel like you're being phony or faking it, that produces like anxiety. That can produce a lot of negative psychological effects. I think it can potentially damage a relationship with close others. I think the family aspect, and I know that's like a lot of what we're talking about today, I think that's a very interesting thing that comes up because as you pointed out, like we're not coming in, there's not like clearly defined rules like at a Better Angels event or at a civic dialogue event on campus where it's like, hey, we're going to do it this way. You're talking about people that have long histories with each other, years, decades, etc. Lots of different experiences, lots of things that have happened that can be stirred up. Being honest with each other is I think usually better in the long run, even if it might be upsetting in the short term, because it doesn't let things like that fester and then have the potential for a bigger blow up. On a broader note, just as a general thing about other, like how self-censorship can be harming, just more in general for society, I think it can distort what we think like public opinion is, essentially. If people aren't telling pollsters or interviewers what they truly think, it starts to distort what the broader landscape is, which I know we're talking more about family and peers today, but as Gabby mentioned, we're swimming in that water and most people's identities are very much informed by this. So if that picture is distorted, I think that's a problem.
Yeah. And, I just want to sort of like pull on that thread a little bit, Sean, because I think also the folks who, you mentioned sort of there's certain personality types, and there's some folks who are going to speak their opinion regardless of environment, who's in the room, whatever the case may be. And I think what's happened is those people who are always willing to speak out also get a lot of attention, right? These are the folks we're seeing on the news all of the time. These are the folks who are getting a lot of like engagement on social media. And so I think what happens, that distortion you were speaking to, is there's this idea that because this person who is the loudest, maybe, and willing to speak out said it, that's how everybody thinks. And I think what I've learned in trying to be a little bit braver and have some more honest individual conversations with people who I know might not agree with me on everything is that most people don't necessarily feel the way we might think they feel about things. And so I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, and that flows from a lot of different veins of research. There's a group more in common out there that's been looking at the more nuanced politics of people in not just the United States and other countries as well, but they find essentially what you just described. You've got kind of these extreme ends of both parties or viewpoints, and they make up about 8 to 10% of the people. But they are the loudest voices in the room. And this also like feeds from spiral of silence theory, where like those voices that are louder, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the dominant opinion. It just means they're kind of drowning out the other people, and it gives the impression that that's the dominant opinion. And so more and more people start thinking that.
Yeah, actually, I'll jump in there because one thing we do in Braver Angels, especially like in the context of if it's a group of liberals and a group of conservatives, we ask each other, where do you agree with your side and where do you disagree with your side? And I think hearing, like, for me, I'm on the left, hearing a group of conservatives be critical of their own side is really interesting. And actually what we talk about, it can often soften when you're able to hear each other be self-critical of your own side, it can really soften the conversation. So it's actually a great tactic to be a little bit self-critical in conversations, because then, people can kind of see some of that nuance.
And I think what that does is it breaks. Most of us have caricatures of stereotypes of the other political side, where we can accurately we can pretty much say like, all right, you probably think this, that, or the other thing, but generally think that the person has a far more extreme or strong version of that thought than they actually do.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'll just share an experience I had at a Braver Angels event a couple of years ago, actually, is most of the people in the room were there because they were feeling alienated by their own party. They were like, I don't recognize this, and I don't actually feel comfortable with the dominant narrative of, if I've been a Republican my whole life or a Democrat my whole life, something is happening. And I don't there was this feeling of, I don't feel at home in this place that used to feel really familiar to me anymore. So it's really quite interesting what is happening, at least politically.
Yeah.
And, I think the difficult thing is sometimes having to put yourself in a place, when we're bringing this back to like a family situation, where it's like, okay, I might have to have this conversation with, my brother who's totally on the opposite. And it might get fiery and it might get really upsetting. And then how are we supposed to sit down and like eat turkey together, you know? And it can be, I think, a little scary to do that and manage those emotions.
For sure.
So I wanna back up a little bit. I feel like we could all have a really interesting conversation, but I did prep some questions here. So let me go back. Sean, I want to talk a little bit about your recent research with FIRE. FIRE does the free speech rankings every year. With universities in the US, but there's a lot of questions that you all are asking as a part of that research. And so I'd love to just learn a little bit more about what you found when you were researching censorship on college campuses.
Yeah, so we started doing the college free speech rankings in 2020. A major component of this is a survey that we run every year. We get tens of thousands of students to respond. The most recent one had about 68,500 students, 257 campuses. We have a core set of 20 questions that we've settled on that we ask every year. The first few years we were kind of figuring these out, but they've now been consistent for the past like 4 or 5 years or so. We have a battery of questions that ask about self-censorship with that definition I read out before. I will say like this is like a positive research experience, and how research is supposed to work is our original question on self-censorship didn't have that definition. It kind of more implies it. It correlates that we still keep and ask that question, and it correlates very highly with the more specific ones we ask. But we got pushback from other researchers that, well, how do you know this? You're not just measuring people being polite with the way this question is phrased. Henceforth, the emergence of a more very strict definition that we think makes it pretty clear that that's not what we're doing. I think that's a positive thing that kind of came out of those debates and those discussions, and how research should ideally go. I'll get off the soapbox on that one and go to the research now. What we generally find, it's been fairly consistent since we've been asking these more specific self-censorship questions. Roughly 1 in 4 students say they self-censor at least a few times a week or more, in conversations with their peers, in conversations with professors, and in classroom discussions. That problem cuts across ideological lines. Liberals report this, conservative students report this, moderate students report this. It is reported more frequently among conservative and moderate students on most campuses. But I emphasize most because we do have, within those 257 or so that we surveyed, there are about 15 or 20 where conservative students outnumber liberal students, at least in our sample. So we would say those are more conservative leaning schools, even if there isn't any of them that have a ratio like Smith of like 30-1. I think the biggest one is maybe like 2-1, but still, like, it's a more conservative campus. And what consistent with spiral of silence theory here, you see liberal students reporting more self-censorship on these campuses because they are more in the minority. So you do see those situational factors there. And then in a related vein, but these questions aren't narrowly about self-censorship, we also ask about comfort level expressing controversial political views. And so on the same thing, we find significant portions of students, this is actually higher than 1 in 4. We get up to 50 and maybe even over 50% with some of these students saying they're not comfortable expressing views just in common campus spaces like the quad or the dining hall. But the one that they're most sensitive to and concerned about is social media, which I think makes a lot of sense. We tend to see a lot of like social media outrage mobs emerge and kind of target people for their expression. There's a lot more, but I'll leave it there because I think those are the meatiest findings in terms of self-censorship that we found.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. 1 in 4 seems quite high to me. Particularly when I think about a university setting that's supposed to be, at least theoretically, about learning, right? And the exchange of ideas and conversation. And so, I do wonder a little bit if, I know, FIRE's only been doing this research for the last number of years, but at least anecdotally, it sort of feels like self-censorship is on the rise. And I wonder if either of you have thoughts about what might be contributing to this rise, and what your perspective is. And Gabby, I'll start with you, and I'd love to hear from you as well, Sean.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things that have been coming to mind for me lately. One is this concept of like frictionlessness. So this idea of like so much in our life, like modern comforts and technology, is about like eliminating friction in our day-to-day lives. And I feel like there's an attitude of like that friction should also be eliminated in our relationships, which is just not how relationships work. And so I think in terms of self-censorship, like if you have something that could potentially cause friction, that feels like it's a bad thing, you know, even though my colleague Monica Guzman has a great saying that heat during a conversation is not a bad thing. It depends on if you're cooking something or burning something. But I think out of the fear of the burn, like people are not willing to cook. You got to let them cook. So I think that's part of it. I think also, I know Emma Camp from Reason is writing a book on risk aversion, and that's been coming up for me too about, you know, young people, this is about taking a risk, putting yourself out there, you know, when you're saying something that's hard. So the resistance towards that. I will say this is more specifically for in the classroom, and this is actually kind of based on personal experience. But as you mentioned before, Mandy, you know, in Bravery Angels, we have guardrails, we have trained moderators, there's a whole program and system to it. But in the classroom, I think like a lot of professors, frankly, aren't equipped to have, you know, to moderate difficult political conversations, at least from my experience. They might be looking to appease students and make things, you know, eliminate the potential friction. So I think that's another, you know, hard thing. That's, again, more campus specific. But yeah, those are some of the things coming up for me.
Yeah, Sean, love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. On the one more narrow thing with the professors, as someone who has, I mean, I haven't taught a college course in like 10 years, but, you know, I think the student feedback things, which can affect professor performance, grades, promotion, etc. I mean, there's professors who they just don't, it's easier to not rock the boat, right? I think that's kind of what Gabby was getting at a little bit. It's like, it's just easier to like, okay, I'm just not going to get into that because I don't need random student to complain, or I don't need to cause friction and cause a firestorm in here. So we'll keep it, we'll just kind of move on and keep the conversation fairly tame. More broadly, I would go, not surprisingly, because I helped Greg and John Haidt on their book, but I would point to some extent to social media and its, you know, over the last 10 to 15 years, its increased role in our day-to-day lives and in our discourse and in the political discourse. I think we now are seeing at the college level, we have a generation where a lot of their socialization occurred on social media, like as maybe even a primary source of it. And you have a lot of control on social media and an ability to reduce exposure to things that could cause upsetness and friction, right? You can just mute a thread. You can just ignore it. You can block a person. You can't do that when you get to campus. And so you kind of lose that ability. And then I think so that's kind of been introduced in a way with the bias reporting systems that a lot of schools have, which I think they kind of perform an analogous function of like blocking someone on social media, perhaps. But so I think a lot of that's not the only thing, for sure. I'm a psychologist. Things are multiply determined, but I do think that's a major factor.
Yeah. And, you know, we talk about social media a lot in this series. Mostly we've talked about the fact that social media companies actually sort of are doing a lot of censorship work that we don't necessarily realize behind the scenes, right? I think there's this, and particularly if you've grown up on social media, maybe you're not super aware of this, but all of that is moderated, right? It is not a public square. And so like my Instagram feed, my Facebook feed, my Twitter feed, whatever is going to look very different from yours or Gabby's, right? Based on our interests, who we follow, what we like, what we interact with, you know. And so it's like an echo chamber, right? But we don't always acknowledge it as such. And I think that creates problems. It's also like people are not having conversations on social media that are like actual conversations, to your point, Sean, right? It's like I'm not saying something and listening and waiting for somebody to respond. I'm just commenting or liking or sharing or whatever. And that's it, right? There's no sort of like reciprocal thing happening there. So I do think there's I don't think we can blame social media 100%, but I certainly think it does exacerbate some of these issues. I'm wondering, and I'll throw this to Gabby first, and then Sean. Are there other spaces where we're seeing self-censorship come up a lot? We've talked a lot about college campuses, but just sort of in general, other places you're noticing this.
Yeah, I think very much like just generally, I think any place you really want to belong, that could be a friend group, that could be a family, that could be, as Mandy, as you said earlier, like a political party that, I think actually I was thinking earlier for myself, like, where do I self-censor the most? And it's actually often with people with whom I agree with. It's with my fellow peers that maybe we agree in an issue, but maybe I don't feel the same level of enthusiasm or the same level of passion, or maybe we agree generally, but there's a specific issue where we disagree, and that's harder to inject, some disagreement on. So I think really anytime that belonging to that group feels high stakes, and not wanting to rock the boat on that. I also think a lot about, the specific relationship. So, we're hearing a lot about children cutting off their parents or not coming to holidays or stuff like that. And I think, especially for parents, maybe they have grandchildren or something like that, and they want to be able to still see their grandchildren, that it's just not worth it to, say something that could cause, a friction, could cause a strain in the relationship. If they want to see their grandchildren or engage in their children's lives or something like that, where the relationship itself maybe feels really high stakes. So that's kind of a more general response, but yeah, I really think about those in groups. And I'll say really quickly, the interesting about families too is that all of us, every relationship has a dynamic and every family has a dynamic, and oftentimes we play these roles in families. Someone's the gladiator, they come in always with the hot take or whatever, and then someone's the sniper, they get in a brief insult and then run away. And so, I mean, that's kind of the good thing about some of this stuff, is that when we play roles in these group dynamics, we can kind of predict how things are going to go and we can prepare for them better. But yeah, I think it can also make it really tricky.
Yeah. Sean, how about you? Any other spaces you're seeing self-censorship in that we haven't talked about yet?
I mean, I think Gabby hit on the important one. Is almost any space where you're trying to belong or feel connected with people. I think there is, starting to see this more in professional settings for sure as well. But yeah, I think it's primarily going to be in family, friendship, relationships, and probably with not necessarily people you vehemently disagree with, because you're actually probably not talking with them that often. It's probably more with someone that you do feel close with, and you're trying to avoid damaging the relationship in some way. But I think I would, and this maybe gets a little bit ahead to our next, like what we're going to get into talking about. But I think those are, when you trust each other, that's when you can actually disagree, because you have that level of trust and knowledge of each other. And would hope that could translate into some of these family relationships, even if there's disagreement over a specific political view or stance. At the end of the day, it's like you're a family, you've known each other for a long time. The roles that we are, right? It's predictable who you're a crazy uncle and you're this and you're that, right? I mean, there's all these stereotypes and caricatures, but there's some truth to them, and knowing that can maybe soften some of the sting of some of these exchanges.
For sure. And I want to just pick on one thing you said about employment or in jobs. I think we've seen there's a couple issues that have really been really big issues for folks losing jobs around speaking out. I think folks who've spoken about Palestine and what's happening there have had issues. And then I think, probably going to get myself in trouble for mentioning this one, speaking of self-censorship, but folks' comments and reactions to Charlie Kirk. I think we saw a lot of negative employment consequences in both of those. And those are just two examples. But I know a lot of FIRE's work is actually defending folks who have had negative things happen based on speech. And a lot of that has been at school or not at school, at work or college campuses or whatever. So just wanted to bring that up as something we haven't quite talked a lot about in this conversation, but I think is definitely prevalent, or, happening more than it should, maybe.
Yeah, just an interesting piece of data to add to that. The only other time I think since I've been at FIRE that we've seen like a flurry of campaigns targeting faculty members, scholars. Like we have this Scholars Under Fire database. So I'd say probably 98% of the entries are faculty and professors, but it has some postdocs, some PhD students, some research fellows. Effectively, the term scholar means you live in the life of an academic. You're teaching, doing research, or both at a university. The only other time, with the exception of this most recent thing with Charlie Kirk, that we've seen volume like that is after George Floyd. But we actually looked into this recently and found that no professor was actually fired for specific comments about George Floyd. There were a handful that were punished. But in general, what happened was a more broader climate for comments about race. With Charlie Kirk, it was specific comments about his assassination. And we had, I think it was something like 80 professors targeted for comments about Kirk. Close to 20 were terminated. About 40 had some kind of punishment. The numbers for Floyd were slightly higher, but I'll stress our numbers for the Floyd year are like for the whole year. Basically, I mean, there were a handful of incidents that happened before him, but then most of them occur afterwards, but we're at around 100. The Charlie Kirk thing is like the last few months.
Yeah.
So it dwarfs even the most similar instance to it since I've ever been at FIRE. It massively dwarfs that.
Yeah, it was incredibly polarizing, putting it lightly. And I think, that just happened in September, right? So what are we at, like two, barely 3 months since that? And that's
almost 3 months now, basically. Yeah.
It's wild. It is absolutely wild. Okay, so I want to like switch topics a little bit here, not really topics, but I want to talk a little bit about how we can avoid the self-censorship, right? How can we promote this like sort of honesty and like open dialogue that I think people really want and are craving, particularly with the people they love. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how you do that at Bravery Angels. How do you promote this climate of open dialogue? And I want to hear it from you as well, Sean, but Gabby, kick us off.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start from a personal level and then go to Braver Angels. But so one of my biggest flexes in life is that I'm from Michigan. I love to flex that on people, that I'm from a swing state. So therefore, my groups are very politically diverse, which is true. Because, we pursue red, blue balance and Braver Angels. This is now how my brain's distorted, that when I went on my bachelorette party, I was like, okay, like a third voted for Trump, like a third voted for Harris, a third didn't vote. Okay. That's how I'm thinking now. Anyway, when I think about my loved ones in my life that I know are more hesitant about sharing what they actually believe, that if I have like an avatar in my brain, it's often like young conservative women or young women who are vaguely conservative, but also kind of apolitical and don't feel confident actually sharing what they believe. And so in those cases, with those friends, I think for one, just saying like what you think matters to me, whether or not you feel like you're the most equipped to be weighing in, like I care about what you think, both as like a friend and a human being, but also like if you have no goodwill in the world, like from a data perspective, from just like, I want to know what other people think perspective. This person's voting. Shouldn't you try to understand what they're thinking as they're going to go vote on their own beliefs? So I think really fostering that idea that like, I really care about what you think. That's asking, as we say in Braver Angels, that's asking questions of curiosity, that's listening. And then two, I think just again, on the interpersonal level, really kind of making clear that like, if you disagree with me, that is not going to shake the foundation of our friendship. In fact, I welcome disagreement. Sometimes that's even like for myself, again, as I was saying earlier, kind of showing, maybe sharing a more controversial opinion myself, or saying something that I feel is hard to say, to kind of open up, this is a space where we can share those hard things together. So that's kind of on the interpersonal level. I think in Braver Angels, again, it's nice that we have these norms. We have the Braver Angels way that we all follow, again, speaking freely, fully, without fear, believing that no one is not worth talking to, these ideas that we really set as a culture. But yeah, I think also just like, again, internally, I think we really do benefit from having those guardrails. And ironically, having those guardrails in our programs creates a space where people can say the hard thing. Because there's, in grad school, I learned about this concept called productive zone of disequilibrium, which is basically this, like, it's the perfect temperature where things are hot enough to feel kind of tense, but not too hot that they go off the rails. And I think in Brave Angels, we're able to create that environment where, giving people the space to say the hard thing, but also having the moderators in place so things don't go off the rails.
Yeah. Sean, would love to hear from you about this as well.
Yeah, I would. So I'd start with the personal too, and I think there's some similar experiences there where my parents were like activist hippies in the 60s who like went down to the South and registered people to vote, and then I wound up my roommate in college for 2 years, who I then was the best man at his wedding about a decade later. He's a cop. He's a conservative Republican police officer and has been since I met him. But we didn't know that about each other at first, and like bonded over other things like being fans of the same football and hockey team and things like that. And then it's like, oh, you happen to find this out, but you have a foundation of a friendship based on other things. And so it's like, okay, so it's okay that you think that way, and I don't necessarily think that way. And then I would, as someone who I've played ice hockey my whole life, so I actually I have a PhD, so I have a lot of academic friends who are not surprisingly left of center, but I play ice hockey, so I know a lot of cops and firemen who are not surprisingly a little bit more right of center. That gives you some perspective, I think, and being able to talk in both spaces. And so maybe that makes it easier for someone like me and maybe someone like Gabby as well to have these conversations. But then to build again on another thing she said, it's like this idea of caring, making it clear that you care about what the other person thinks. I mean, what I hear there is Greg Lukianoff, our president, has this idea of like the looking glass theory of freedom of speech, and why FIRE has the view that it does have. It's like, well, it might really bother you that your uncle thinks that wizard people run the world and live under the Denver airport, but it might be useful information to know that your uncle thinks that wizard people live under the airport in Denver and run the world, because now it's like, all right, I might not trust him on a few other things that he says right now, right? And we can laugh this off because it is kind of funny in a way. And so I think forming relationships outside of it being based on politics can go a long way to helping this, because then when you find out that you don't agree on everything politically, because inevitably you probably don't agree with everything politically with anybody on, there's more of a foundation there to navigate that. I think like that's this falling into politics becoming so part of our identities now. I'd love us to move away from that a little bit.
Yeah. One thing I'd add there too, one thing that like fundamentally changed the way that I engage in political conversations is not trying to persuade anyone. Like at Braver Angels, that's a core principle of ours, is to just like give up trying to persuade someone you disagree with, really just try to understand what they think. Like I really used to go into every political conversation thinking it was my role to change this person's mind. And of course, when you do that, the person becomes more defensive and there's less trust. People can feel, what you're trying to do. So I think that's a really big thing. I'll also just say quickly, a lot of Brave Angels, our co-founder, Bill Doherty, is a marriage and family therapist. So there's some therapy principles there, but like speaking from like I language, saying like I feel or I think, that is helpful. If you're saying like, I don't know, like I'm worried about this thing. I'm worried about, I don't know, what Donald Trump is doing in X, Y, and Z versus Republicans are, it's a very different tone. So that can be really helpful too, just really speaking from your own perspective.
Yeah. Sean, did you have something you wanted to add there? So I come off
I
mute
was
briefly.
just gonna say, like, on the persuasion point. I mean, I kind of adopt the same strategy, and I think that like, you could look at a lot of social psychological research, political psychological research that backs that up. Most people are not very persuadable in terms of completely just one conversation is not just going to switch their political views. It can happen, sure, but it probably requires some pretty significant event, and probably something that's impacted them personally, and not just like okay, so 9/11 happened, great. Impacting the country, and like it's more. I do have a friend who his family was in, heavily involved in commercial real estate in New York City at the time, and so that really affected him and certainly changed his political views at the age of 18. But more broadly, I think most people kind of stayed where they were.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple sort of themes that are emerging from both of what what you both shared. One is, I think there needs to be a little bit more of an emphasis on listening, right? Everybody wants to talk. Listening is actually a skill, right? And being able to listen and just listen with an open mind is, I think, difficult for a lot of people. We don't practice that very often. The other thing is that I heard from both of you is this like willingness to engage regardless of whatever the person is going to say or feel about something. And I think that's also a skill and a little bit tricky and difficult because, as you mentioned, Gabby, there could be a little bit of friction there, a little bit of heat that we don't necessarily love. And so I think it's really helpful to keep both of those things in mind when we're potentially going to sit down at family dinner or holiday dinner or whatever, is this idea of like, hey, you know what? I am going to hear my cousin out or my uncle about the lizards under the airport. I don't know. Maybe this will be entertaining, if nothing else, right? And showing up without an agenda, not trying to convince anybody of any particular thing. I think those are three things that are skills that have to be practiced, and a lot of us are not very practiced in doing those three things. So I appreciate all of your input on that. And my last question for both of you, and Sean, I'm going to start with you on this one, is if you have any particular resources or things that you would point somebody to say like, okay, they've listened to this program, they've decided they want to go home with an open mind and not try to do as much self-censorship this year. Is there something they could read or look at that might be helpful in getting prepared? So Sean, your thoughts, and then Gabby.
So that's probably the toughest question. As I say to people a lot of the time, I'm fairly good at diagnosing the problem and its frequency, but solving it's a little harder. Things I would recommend is, what I find helpful is there's lots of scholars out there on either side of the spectrum. Like a right of center person, slightly right of center person that comes to mind for me is Arthur Brooks. Might still be the head of AEI, I'm not sure. But he, a few years ago, like he has this book called Love Your Enemies. And it's basically, you shouldn't have contempt for your enemies. You need to try to show them love and try to understand them. And I think if you can find thinkers that have different political views than you, but you don't see them as like bomb throwers, like you see them as reasonable people, I'd start there. Get exposed to the ideas there, because they're going to be presented in a more reasonable way than the bomb throwers in that 8-10% group that we were talking about earlier on either side. And I think there's a lot more people that fall in these categories that you could find and get exposure and start to maybe push the door open slightly to like, oh, as Gabby was saying, it's like, oh, maybe it's like that I feel concerned about what some of these people are doing, but not all Republicans or not all Democrats are like that. And I can see that through exposure to these ideas. That's where I would start. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough mindset to adopt, but just in the mindset of I'm not going to try to persuade you. and I'm gonna try to listen, I think does go a long way. Although I don't necessarily know how to like do that for everybody.
Yeah, not as easy as turning a switch on, right? Takes practice. Gabby, what are your thoughts? What some homework for our viewers today?
Yes. Well, I definitely agree. It takes practice. I mean, it's very funny. I used to be very polarized and very much so struggle with these conversations. So you can, I think, definitely find improvement on it. But I would say, so, I mean, Braver Angels is really in the business of trying to help people speak across differences. So we have a lot of great programs. I'll specifically plug, so we have tons of workshops, we have tons of debates, we have e-courses, one-on-one conversations. I mean, you go to our website, people get really overwhelmed. I'll specifically plug the Family and Politics e-course because, again, especially if you're coming up to the holidays, it really gets into the specifics of the family dynamics and what makes it especially difficult, because I think sometimes people feel like this is my family, like this should be the easiest place to share what I believe. But oftentimes there's all these other things at play, family, there's a lot of history in family. There are a lot of dynamics there. Sometimes, we're fighting about politics, but it actually becomes about, you always loved my brother more. There are all these other things happening in those conversations that I think are really interesting to dig into. So the Family and Politics e-course for Braver Angels, I would plug. I would also recommend, one of our most successful programs actually is our one-on-one conversations, which is you get paired with someone either across the aisle or maybe someone who, if you're in an urban area, maybe they're rural, or maybe if you're younger, they're older, you get paired with someone who's really different from you. And that's like some of our best programming is where people just have a one-on-one conversation with someone. So that's another great thing to do. Really, any of our workshops, look up your local alliances. That's great. And then, I mentioned Monica Guzman earlier. She's a great friend, and I'm a really big fan of hers. She has a great book. I never thought of it that way. That really digs into a lot of these dynamics. She says a proud liberal daughter. She's a Mexican immigrant, and her two parents voted for Trump, and they talk about, their relationship there. There was also a great podcast series that she did, a Braver Way podcast. If you're a podcast person, she gets into a lot of this there. So there's a lot of really great thinkers in this space. Arthur Brooks is another, as Sean mentioned. Amanda Ripley, High Conflict is a great book. David McRaney. There are a lot of wonderful thinkers, but I won't overwhelm people.
Well, I appreciate all of those things. And folks, if you're listening, we do have a bookshop page of all books mentioned by all of our Censorship Series guests. So I will add everything that Gabby and Sean mentioned to that list later today, as well as anybody who registered for this program on Eventbrite is going to get a follow-up email from me, with all the links that you both mentioned. So no need to furiously scramble anything down, but you can rewatch this program as many times as you want also, because it will live on YouTube forever. So thank you both so much. I really appreciated this conversation. I also just want to say, for folks who are listening, we know these conversations are not easy. We know that it is a tough time here, at least in the United States, to be having these difficult conversations, particularly if you are somebody who is struggling with an identity that is very much being attacked right now. Somebody maybe who's LGBTQ, folks who are not white. These conversations are layered and difficult. And so this was just a 48-minute chat to kind of get the juices flowing, get people thinking about how to not do so much self-censorship this holiday season. And I hope it was helpful to at least kind of start people off. So Gabby and Sean, I want to thank you both so much for being here, but also for your work. This is not always easy stuff. And I appreciate that you two are out there doing the work, studying it, and equipping people with these skills. So thanks, folks, so much for being here. If you're interested in the Censorship Series, all of our past conversations are linked in a playlist on our YouTube page. They all have ASL interpretation, so please check those out. And I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season. And thanks to Bailey and Kaylee for interpreting for us today.